Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. I am super excited today to speak to Tenby Powell for a bunch of reasons. Obviously, obsession with the war in Ukraine. Obviously, a shared obsession with trying to help those in desperate need of help. But also he's a Kiwi and I have an affinity for New Zealand. I'm a big Kiwi file. I spent a year there backpacking in 2000, been there previously on holiday when my parents used to live in Hong Kong, and just absolutely loved the country, almost stayed out there for good. And my sister lives out there. Fun fact for you viewers, my sister is married to a triple Commonwealth gold medal Kiwi weightlifter who they live in Tauranga, which is where your man Tenby Powell used to be a mayor of. So anyway, this is and I'm wearing a Northland rugby jersey to show my affinity for New Zealand. So I could wax lyrical about New Zealand, my favorite country on earth, for a long time, but you haven't come here to listen to that. I'm sure I'll squeeze some little references in. I would just like to welcome Tenby Powell to this and give him a chance to say hello and obviously introduce himself to you, the audience, and let him know what you let you guys know what he is about and what he's up to. So big long introduction there, waffling me. Thanks, Tenby, for coming to join us.
Hi, Jonathan. It's great to be here with you, and thank you for that warm introduction for New Zealand. I did notice your rugby jersey, and great to hear your sister is in wonderful sunny Tauranga, which is New Zealand's fastest growing city, in fact.
Is it really?
It is, yeah.
So I would just let people know where that is for those who are interested. We have Tauranga here and Mount Maunganui, which has some great swimming. I got a sorry to interrupt you already, mate, but when I went from the Bay of Islands down to Wellington in a car with my mate, we set our route on wherever we could stop for like thermal pools, and there is a great set of thermal swimming pools in Mount Maunganui, and absolutely loved it there. It was superb, and someone put some shampoo in the water there, and the whole thing turned into just a foam bath pretty quickly. But anyway, my experience of sleeping in the back of an estate car on the beach at Mount Maunganui is long in the memory. Anyway, carry on.
If you're sleeping in a car and you didn't do it at Mount Maunganui, something's very wrong. So that's fantastic. Generations of teenagers and young 20-year-olds have done exactly that. In fact, I might have done it myself on a time many decades ago. So, Jonathan, grateful to you to have the opportunity to talk to your wonderful British audience about our work in Ukraine. And this is one of the few times when I don't have to say we are Kiwis named after the bird and not the fruit. Because normally I do need to explain to people, and particularly Eastern Europe, that it's not about the fruit. And there's this crazy little flight, this bird, which is very rare, a lot like the rest of us New Zealanders. So we have been Kiwi Care, and this is care with a K, an acronym, standing for Kiwi Aid and Refugee Evacuation, has been operating in Ukraine since May 2022. And I think you asked me why, and I will come to that, but the core role has remained a constant, although we have grown remarkably in this 2.5 years in terms of the services that we provide. But the core role is still to provide humanitarian and medical aid forward, putting it directly into the hands of those that need it in red zone towns and villages mostly, and doing evacuations rearward. And this is where we certainly have grown quite substantially in respect of the medical capability that we now bring, and I'm happy to talk about that.
So that's interesting, and just to let you know as well that's actually a lot of my audience are Americans, so they might like to know that about Kiwis as well. But that's really fantastic. So okay, let's rewind a little, find out a little bit about yourself, and then what put you in a position to be doing what you're doing, and what got you as interested in doing what you are doing. So give us some sense of who you are, where you've come from.
Sure. Well, look, I'm just going to summarize this, but I've got a military background and a business background, both at senior level. Had some successes in business, which makes it, enables me to be able to do these things, which I'm very passionate about. Why Ukraine? Well, in my view, and I was interviewed when we first went in New Zealand in June 2022, or before I was going actually, And I will repeat what I said then, because I even believe it more strongly than ever today, excuse me, is that this particular war has the potential to change world order as we know it. And not only in respect of country alliances, which we're beginning to see, some very odd ones really, Russia, Iran, Russia, North Korea, and so forth, but also in terms of supply chain, the fracturing of various supply chains. And for an example, Ukraine produces 30% of the world's sunflower oil. And I say this to people in New Zealand, wonder why wheat-based products and oil-based products at the supermarket shelves are more expensive today than they were, look to Ukraine. Now, I am not by any means suggesting that the Ukrainian war, or Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, is creating all the economic and particularly inflationary woes in the world today. It is not, but it is most certainly having an impact, and particularly given it is the food basket of Europe in many respects. And those supply chains have been severed, and most of them haven't really come back in the way that they were in terms of efficiencies. So there's a productivity level as a consequence of that. Anyway, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, if this escalates, and it has every potential still to do that, and in so many different ways, it's going to have a huge and dramatic impact on Europe.
This is music to my ears in terms of, so I gave a talk up in Stockbridge in north of Hampshire in the UK sometime back, where I was trying to establish that we are indeed in World War III, but we don't really know it. And this conflict has such a global reach that is beyond most people's daily recognition in terms of things like trade, politics, economics, but also information warfare, cyber warfare, conventional warfare. We are providing everything we can to Ukraine, bar soldiers on the ground. And even then, we've probably got special forces on the ground, et cetera, et cetera. So for all intents and purposes, I think this is a global war with a global reach, and it affects people in ways. Hydrocarbons is another one to add to kind of food security, et cetera, et cetera. So absolutely spot on as far as I'm concerned. From a personal point of view, what was it about this war, if this was indeed a dimension that you think was look,
it was. I mean, interestingly, 20 years ago, almost to the day, I was deputy commander of a unit that operated amongst the Hezbollah in South Lebanon. And, I would take Kiwi care to Beirut for sure if I felt I've got many, many friends in Lebanon, and I've got many friends in Israel too, just to be very clear. There's no way that we could operate in Gaza. We would never get in, and if we were to get in, we'd probably die in there. And there's been more aid workers killed in Gaza than there has been in any one area in the world en masse for many, many years. So Kiwi Care is not limited to Ukraine, and I want to make that really clear today. While it started because of my view that this has the potential to change world order, and I had, as I said, a military background, and have had a senior business background, and I felt that the two were going to be needed to do what I wanted to do, which has been borne out to be absolutely true. And in fact, it's more business than it is military. We are humanitarian aid workers. We are not soldiers. We don't pretend to be soldiers. We do not and will not, under any circumstance, transport troops, ammunition, or weapon systems. But we do take medical aid forward to the forward medical units if they need it, and give them support in that regard. And this has included ambulances. To date, we have bought 23 ambulances from New Zealand and Australia, and I've got another 10 coming from New Zealand soonish. Those are the Australian ones that we've just brought in the last little while. And, those assets are extremely important. The British Ministry of Defence came out some time ago, Jonathan, and said that one of the methods of warfare that Russia is clearly demonstrating is attacks on hospitals.
Which we saw in Sumy only yesterday with a double tap.
That's right.
Strike on
and more recently, well, not more recently, but recently, of course, there was the dreadful attack on the Children's Hospital in Kiev, which has an oncology specialist capability. Absolutely, horrific, and it's a war crime. To date, and I have lost track a little bit, but there's been over 800 attacks reported on hospitals, of which about 250 have been completely destroyed. The one asset that sits around a hospital more than any other one are ambulances, of course. And so they have lost a lot of ambulances, hence the compelling need to bring ambulances through. And I did have a very positive, you'll be interested in this, a very positive meeting with London Ambulance Service. They were great. I went out to their headquarters, to talk about how we could partner, and we're still working on exactly how that might happen. But it would be great if we could get a relationship with a European entity, and ideally France or Germany or Italy or someone like that, who have left-hand drive ambulances that we could take when they towards the end of life. The New Zealand and Australian ambulances we brought through, like any large fleet, it gets to a point where the repairs and maintenance doesn't justify keeping it, and it's better to move them on. Now, the ones that because of the maintenance scheduling in New Zealand and Australia, we've got some extremely good vehicles. They're all Mercedes Sprinters, but it would be good to have a left-hand drive vehicle and not a right-hand drive vehicle for obvious reasons. And so we've been doing that. We've just started an initiative called Road of Life, which is effectively, to cut to the chase on it, an ambulance service that Kiwi Care will run and fund ourselves. We've been doing it anyway. We've just put a name around it, and we've now kept 4 of the recent ambulances for that purpose. 2 ambulances are going to operate in the Kharkiv area. 2 are going to operate down in Kherson with the ability to range into Zaporizhia, which is, kind of the areas that we know really well. And when I say Kharkiv, I mean right up to, the areas where there are still people living curiously in Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, all these areas behind Bakhmut. So, and if we need to, if for any reason we need to push one up towards Sumy, which of course is the major town city before the Kursk operation that's happened, we would do so there as well, of course. So Road of Life is really the next capability that we're going to start deploying. And a lot of it is taking health professionals into the red zones, where the population that still lives there hasn't seen a doctor or a nurse in some cases for years. So being able to provide that service is going to be great. And I should include in that dentistry. You know what it's like to have a toothache, and and some of these poor folk haven't seen anyone, including a dentist, for many years.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's really interesting. We've just fundraised and got 4 Land Rover Snatch Kazovac vehicles out, with drone protection and whatnot, out to the front lines, which is fantastic. And they're of course right-hand drive as well, being coming from the UK. But we did that through with American, mainly American support doing that. A guy called Greg Terry and a few other channels really heavily involved in fundraising. But yeah. It's obviously not ideal having, although there is if you're on the front lines, there are some people that say something, because a lot of the SUVs, I was out there in February this year, so many SUVs have like British number plates on or Irish number plates, and you just think, oh my goodness, there's just an awful lot of them, and of course they're all right-hand drive, and actually snipers, if snipers are around, sometimes go for the right-hand part of the windscreen.
It's not a huge impediment. It's just that sometimes the young guy's not used to driving that side of the vehicle, panic. But now I've just realised, with your Ukrainian hat on, I better put my Kiwi hat on. New Zealand hat.
Absolutely. And just to remind people, you were indeed mayor of Tauranga, weren't you?
I was. Yeah.
So we are in the company of dignitaries here.
No, nothing like that. We New Zealanders, we're not like that at all. We don't worry about that sort of, hierarchical stuff.
Absolutely,
mate.
So you're heavily involved in supporting Ukrainian needs in the medical domain.
We started, when we started Kiwi Care, we were probably 80% humanitarian, which is anything and everything you can think of, including food, water, toothbrushes, razors, sanitary products, and hygiene products for women, you name it. We're probably now 80% medical in terms of the stuff that we take forward, and 20% humanitarian, which has led us naturally and progressively into working with doctors and nurses and having health professionals accompany us, and in fact grab the ambulances themselves, and I'll come to that in a second, and operate clinics, mobile clinics, and what have you, in the red zones. So
is that driven by the need? Like, is that because as you went along, you realised that actually we need to be doing this rather than this? Like at the beginning, there was refugees going, and humanitarian aid was obviously at the top of people's agenda, but actually 2.5 years later, things are different.
In the beginning, it was more often than not long haul transportation for family groups trying to get out of areas where they just couldn't live anymore. And then, of course, there was that most incredible Ukrainian counteroffensive in the the spring, the autumn of 22 and into 23, just extraordinary. And we got access as a consequence of that to many of the red zone villages that have been newly liberated. And that still remains the case today. We're talking, hundreds and hundreds of square kilometres of land. And of course, because of our dear friend Speaker Johnson filibustering in the US in the Senate and what have you, the supplies to Ukraine to maintain that momentum stopped. And the maintenance of the momentum during a counter-offensive particularly is a principle of war. Once you've got it, you do not lose it. And they had to lose it and shore themselves up because they had run out of material, weapons, ammunition, and other resources. And of course, in that time, which is a long time, the Russians have absolutely shored up their defensive posture in and around all those areas that we are now seeing, lots of pressure on, and I'm thinking now particularly of Pokrovsk.
Yeah, it's become very much positional with some flashpoints where the Ukrainians are under immense amount of pressures because possibly they didn't have the defenses that they needed, like in the way that the Russians actually built some pretty decent defenses. The Ukrainians, in some places, unfortunately, didn't do that to the required degree. And so the only weaknesses really are north of the border in places like Kursk, which is why we see success up in Kursk. But, you wouldn't put all of those troops and material, they'll just get swallowed up on the front line and just involved in slowing down. So
but bear in mind they were on a real roll, so there was no significant requirement to develop defensive structures such as big entrenchments, big minefields, large tank traps. There was none of that necessary when you're going forward at the pace that they were going forward at. They had to stop because they just ran out of resources.
Those supply lines would have been very long, and they didn't have
that's right. But Jonathan, it's important, I think, to note that even though they have lost certain places, Bakhmut, for example, and Pokrovsk is now under pretty significant pressure, they haven't withdrawn. They have held the line with very, very little. They've had more since, of course, and they've been able to do, and every time they get resources, they're able to make a very significant impact, which they're still doing. And which I don't know how how much your listeners know about Ukraine as a country, but to the untrained eye, it is one big glorious farm, which in fact it is, except it's a lot more than that. And we're seeing it's been, it's a highly technical country. Fintech, financial technology, for example, a whole range of computer software products are developed out of Ukraine, and they're really good ones. And of course, now Ukraine will come out of this war leading drone technology. And this is where these swarms of drones that they're developing, this is where they've been able to hold the line more than often, using drones in the way that they've done. And so you are, really quite extraordinary, the amount of tech development that is going on at the same time.
It's quite interesting because I always think about, this is a very big cloud for Ukraine, but given what the projected future is or might be, you want to come out of this in as strong position as possible and take advantage of certain things as much as you can. So war technology, defense industry, I mean, we might cast aspersions on military industrial complexes, etc., but Ukraine had to come out of this conflict with some kind of benefit in some areas to be able to really hammer that advantage. So things
and I'm sure they will. I'm sure they will. I mean, they've rewritten the copybook on asymmetric warfare. They're taking out a $40 million T-80 tank with a $400 drone.
It was Robert Magyar, the drone guy, and his Magyar's Birds recently saying that in 6 months, and I don't know, there's an element of talking it up here, but he's saying in 6 months we don't expect to have drone operators in the field. He's talking about that much automation and AI being used, and it could, who are we to disagree? But a question here already for you from Kevin Force. Tenby, we have heard that many of the civilians that remain in frontline towns, so you were talking about, say, your experiences of helping out in those newly liberated towns in Kharkiv Oblast. Many people left behind in the frontline towns are elderly, and of course we can add to that vulnerable, disabled, physically or mentally, all sorts of issues. It's the most vulnerable in society to get left behind. Has that been your experience? Is it challenging getting elder care?
That's exactly right. The K, whoever K is, and as Kevin, isn't it? Sorry, Kevin. Yeah. Kevin's question is absolutely accurate. The vast majority of those whom we evacuate are elderly people. and most of them have a medical condition of some sort. And it not necessarily an injury, but often a medical condition that they need transportation back to either Kharkiv or Dnipro, or in some instances right back to Kiev, to a specialist hospital for whatever reason. So Kevin's quite right in that assumption.
And so, do you find that your work is not that you do this to be appreciated, right? But have the Ukrainians themselves communicated your value to them?
Yeah.
Do you understand that,
I can,
that you are?
I can give you a story about something quite unrelated to what we're talking about, and perhaps it's appropriate to do that now. The other thing that we identified very quickly is, as a consequence of Russia's attack on infrastructure, and mostly power and water, in addition to hospitals and schools and what have you, but from a power and water specifically, from that perspective, we have we've fabricated probably almost 3,000 wood-burning stoves and water boilers. And we've done it by having some pretty high-profile Ukrainians that have got a big social media presence, influencers, if you will, to reach out to people and ask for what we would call in the UK or the US or New Zealand electrical water cylinders, and they can't be repaired, and so they're lying in the backyard, and they've got a new one in their home. These things have come to Kiev, to our small fabrication facility, in their hundreds, in fact, probably thousands actually. And we've got a core team of fabricators that strip these things down to access the core tank and rebuild them as either a wood-burning stove, which provides heat, and you can cook on this thing and whatever. And it doesn't need to be wood, by the way. Anything that's around that's combustible can go into the stove. And a double unit, kind of welded together, where the bottom unit's the stove and the top one is, say, a 150, 250 litre tank full of water. Because in some cases, this is the only hot water that they've got access to. And everyone knows what the Eastern European winters are like. They're brutal.
I was sorry, I was looking because the other day when I was sorting this out, I saw a whole bunch of pictures of a range of those stoves, and I can't find where it is.
If you look at my Facebook page, you'll see them. It might be a while ago now. But the reason I was telling this story is that these stoves have been described as life-saving by many of the families that have got them, and they are hugely grateful. And we put a small brass plaque on it that simply says "With love from New Zealand," and the New Zealand map, of a very unusual shaped country. And so the brand New Zealand is getting really well known in Ukraine, very positively. But to answer your question about are they grateful, hugely grateful for these. And I can tell this, often sick people, when you transport them to a hospital, they're taken out of the back of the ambulance and they're whisked away. I'm sure that they are grateful. I know they are, actually. But when we hand over a stove like to that, and I know that guy, I remember he was that was one of the, because I can tell by the stove too, it's one of the first iterations. They're a bit more, they're not quite as agricultural looking now. But he was, beside himself. Yeah, and that's the water. That double unit is the water boiling one, and those pipes on the top of the flues, of course, that they get attached when they are put in situ, and that acts as a chimney or a flue.
Yeah, and I can't remember where I saw it, but there were just, and you can see there are lots of these there that you have created for these guys in the background and whatnot. So obviously, this is super practical and useful. Exactly what people need.
They are super practical because they're light and they can be moved really, really easily. And they're extremely effective. As I said, heat, cooking, boiling water. You can put anything in them. I mean, obviously they're designed for wood, but if you've got any other rubbish that you can find that will burn and heat it up, then that's fine too. And look, we've had many people come to us and say, look, we've got these stoves that we manufacture and here's a great price. People forget that we don't pay for these. These, other than that, we pay a stipend to our Ukrainian welders, but we get the raw product for free. And, we are an entity. Kiwi Care doesn't pay salaries. We are all volunteers. And we've had some exceptionally clever people come and volunteer for us. And, it's led us down this path of saying, how do we innovate? How do we really move the dial for those Ukrainians that we reach out and touch? And most specifically, where is core business for us? How can we make a difference and add value to particularly the very, very large aid agencies? And and we decided it was this ambulance service called Road of Life, and doing things like these wood burning stoves and water boilers, which are have become core. They were ancillary to humanitarian medical aid forward and evacuations rearward. They are now equally as core.
So and I'm putting this up on the screen, and I've put the link to this in the description to the video. So this is Kiwi Care Ukraine, Kiwi Aid, and refugee evacuation, and your fundraising that you're doing there. So what would people's donations go towards? Like what's the sort of work that you do on a daily basis?
They go directly towards really one of three things: running the vehicles and repairing them, so repairs and maintenance and running of the vehicles. Getting these stoves. I'd love to really lift up and start fabricating these stoves in the hundreds and hundreds per week. We need to do that because of the need. And, we have requests from mayors of towns, village leaders, you name it, even governors. I've got so many letters requesting 150 stoves for this particular part of a village, or 500 stoves and X number of water boilers constantly. And, to do that, we do need what I would describe as a strategic we need strategic funding support, and we are, on the lookout right now and pitching to businesses and high net worths, because we put aid directly into the hands of those that need it. So if you look at almost singularly the biggest, and I'm picking my words here, but with the big aid agencies, and I'm not mentioning anyone in particular, the administration and overhead salaries and what have you is probably the biggest cost. And then there would be vehicles in the running. We don't have salaries. We don't have an administrative overhead. And, we don't stay in salubrious digs at all, ever. And when we're out east, we, as you can imagine, with some 12 million people that have been displaced, and probably half of that are internally, they're IDPs, internally displaced persons. We get keys to apartments and houses, and we stay there for free, and we make sure we clean it up in the end, and we pass the key back when we get back to Kiev or wherever it comes from. So, we live on the smell of an oily rag, and the whole thing is designed to really deliver value, whatever it is, and put it directly into the hands of those who need it most, Jonathan. So we don't use third-party warehouses at all, which is why we go forward. To use a trucking term, we are a last-mile deliverer.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I've spoken to several people involved in work, whether it be Pierre and Anton at Base UA, whether it be Ada Wordsworth at CARP, people who are small but really meaningful charitable entities. And there is this division out there between these large multinational charities like International Red Crosses, et cetera, who I've driven past. I was in a hotel. Where was it we stayed? Might be Dnipropetrovsk, where there was a bunch of these white International Red Cross utes just like parked there, shiny, didn't look like they've ever been driven anywhere. We drive up in our battle bus. You see this around.
Yeah, I'm not going to cast aspersions on any of them, including the Red Cross, and very sadly, the Red Cross lost some people the other day. Horrific, really. And we know many of them, and they're all great people. We just have a different operating model, and they would probably say, well, how are you going to sustain it? Well, without volunteers around the world would actually stop spinning on its orbit. And if you look at, there's so many volunteer groups who have had decades and decades of service, and they keep getting Doctors Without Borders is a classic example, right? And they keep getting highly qualified doctors to do whatever they need to do. And the dream is that Kiwi Care will become one of those entities that becomes Granddad's axe, no matter who's there. It's had 2 or 3 heads and 10 handles, but it's still going on and evolving and growing and being able to deliver humanitarian service to whoever and wherever it's needed.
For those who know British television history, that is Trigger's broom in Only Fools and Horses that he's referring to. And for those with a philosophical knowledge, that is called the Ship of Theseus, which is the idea that you take a ship and you replace every single part of that ship. Is it still the same ship? That's what he's referring to.
Yeah. Sorry, that's right. I keep forgetting. Some people don't know these quirky British things that we've all grown up with, mate.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's fantastic, and it is. We don't want to denigrate the work of these larger multinational entities, because as you say, they operate on different models, and that can include, a much more careful approach to health and safety. That's not to say that you will be like carefree and overly risky, but you are able to take greater risks, arguably.
We are pedantic about health and safety. Given the environment that we operate in. So, we don't bumble into places. We do a lot of planning. We have great relationships with the military because we need to resupply the medical units with bandages and drips and tourniquets and whatever else it could be. And there's times when they will reach out to us and say, look, we have a village in and around where we're operating, and we haven't got the resources to help them. Please come and we'll give you an escort into that place, and we will escort you out of there. And that happens, increasingly.
Do they do that because you've got that smaller localized relationship with them, rather than say the International Red Cross, who there isn't that kind of personal touch? Like there isn't someone necessarily you could phone up. Like you are, I don't know, because I get that sense. We do a lot of work with Greg Terry and Genya. That's, I was talking about these 4 Snatch Land Rovers, and they are going up and down the front line. And they are networking the entire time they're out there by making contacts with individual groups, and their network is growing and growing. So they've got these personal relationships that allow them to help more.
And that's the thing, and we do the same. So we, if we can do, we'll meet with a village, a town, or a city elder in some way, whether it's a local government official or whether it's somebody that just happens to be the boss in some way. And we will say, if you need us, call us, and we will come. And, sometimes we've got to triage those calls and make sure we go to the most necessary ones first. But I should say, and I'd be remiss in not having said this, KiwiCare partners with an incredible bunch of Ukrainians whose foundation is called Day by Day, a registered Ukrainian humanitarian foundation. And Day by Day and KiwiCare are really, just one and the same. And we work together on everything. We co-brand our vehicles together. And as Ukrainians, of course, they have, direct access to all these people. And that's what makes a difference. We're not an isolated volunteer group working separately to Ukrainians. I mean, there's nothing that we would do without permission and requests from Ukraine in some way.
Yeah, so on the screen at the moment, there's Day by Day, which is the Ukrainian entity that Tenby was talking about. Interesting. So what for you have been the biggest challenges, practically on human terms, on logistics terms, or on international terms? I don't know. What have you found frustrating?
The biggest worry, if you will, is continuity of funds, because it's funding that keeps the wheels of humanitarian aid rolling. So when I'm back in New Zealand, I've done over 50 speeches, fundraising speeches around New Zealand and Australia now, and that's really all I do when I'm back. And they prove to be very successful, and they've certainly kept things going for sure. But this is where I come back to, we are on the hunt for either a business that wants to get involved, and they can do it behind the scenes without us ever mentioning them, and I can understand why some would want that, or a high net worth that really wants to throw some weight behind what we're doing and become a part of our board, if you will, if that's what they want. We'll be delighted to do that. We've got a great bunch of trustees, but we are really focused on a strategic shift for KiwiCare right now, because we know what we could do if we could, get a level of funding that would lift us to another level or two.
Yeah, and that's so important. You look at these billionaires around the world and you think, oh man, you could really make the world a better place. And some of them do, in fact, with regard to Ukraine. So who are the two? Howard Buffett is his foundation that started by his father is they've given like hundreds of millions to Ukraine, actually since 2014, sorry. And then George Soros as well does an awful lot for Ukraine too. So I know that's a divisive figure in American politics, but actually as far as Ukraine's concerned, he's been like absolutely incredible in supporting Ukraine. So there are people, these high net worth individuals, but obviously for someone like you, it would be a dream come true if someone comes and says, we could make a real difference, and I hope that at some stage we get a call out of the blue, because we've got, as I said, we've got a very good group of trustees, a board, if you will, in New Zealand, and we are making impacts in other ways because of their connections. Well, for all the ways that that my audience can help, please do, guys. You can see Tenby he's a good man, doing a good thing, and so please help out as much as you can. Go across to the link in the description below and do what you can. I know we're doing this consistently. We've been doing it for 2.5 years, and it's exhausting financially for us. But we're all still as obsessed as we are for still being here. So if you do have the wherewithal to help out Tenby, please do.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John.
Yeah, no problem at all. What have you learnt about yourself, actually? First of all, what have you learnt about yourself while doing all of this?
I think it is a passion. There's no doubt about that. I think I've learnt that it is that the continuity of getting up every day to do something for someone else and not expecting anything, and most particularly because we don't get paid, has been a revelation as to how rewarding that can be, without wanting to be too philosophical about it, because the need is real. This isn't something you sort of just go and do for fun. And it's not about seeking reward, but I think where I might have in my mind said, look, we'll go and do this for a while, see if we can help out, try and make a contribution, and then I'll get back to, I don't think there's any going back now, because it is so rewarding.
You're not the only person that said that. So when I went around Ukraine myself with 3 others, so I've mentioned Greg and Jenny already. So an American pastor, I'm an atheist philosopher. He's a Christian pastor with these commonalities.
That must have been a fun trip.
It was brilliant, because we're celebrating the commonalities there rather than the differences. Right. So so you got these two guys. He's been going to Ukraine for 26 years, right? And so that's in him. He's in it for the long haul. Then there was Pierre, who's a British guy, volunteer from Kramatorsk, who is still going out there as and when he can, and he's been doing that for years. And he very much embodied, all of them did, this idea that, okay, I came here to help, and now I'm here for the long haul. And there's something about this as a, I don't know, calling, whether that's the right word, but it's a sort of, there is no other option here. I'm in here, and I naturally just have to stay doing it. So I can imagine if I was more mobile. I have primary progressive multiple sclerosis, so I'm not the most physically active guy. So otherwise, I think I would be out, and I probably wouldn't be doing this, because I'll still be doing my teaching job. But like, life is a funny thing when you end up doing something that you both love and incredibly important to do, that matters in the way that you're talking about, that I would find it hard pressed not to be in Ukraine helping. But so it's interesting. So, okay, so that's what you've learned about yourself. What have you learned about others, like positive and negative, both in Ukraine, Ukrainians, and other people around the world? What have you learned about the human psyche? What has this taught you?
Well, look, I mean, this can be polarizing, this war, and the stuff that we do. I've learned that people that I might have thought would have been very supportive, some are not. And I've lost some friends, and I've learned that those who I would have thought would be skeptical at best and probably very dismissive, many have not been, and they have become friends, and that is interesting. So it's sort of a realignment of ducks, if you will, and that's life.
Are you reflecting political ideals that were at play there?
Yeah, I mean, the big 2 things that we hear it everywhere, right, is that Ukraine is a Nazi state, which is just complete and utter gibberish, and that if it wasn't for the US and NATO, they wouldn't be in this pickle. Well, the last time I looked, Ukraine is not in NATO, and the Ukraine is, in fact, the sharp end in terms of a buffer zone for Europe. And of course, they have, for some time, since their independence, really, or thereabouts in 1992, been looking more to the west than the east. And they want what the west has got. They want to be a progressive...
Sorry, I lost you for about 30 seconds. The connection's gone a bit dodge. Could you just repeat that last 30 seconds for me? I don't know if the audience did, but I lost you.
I was saying that, the people who have, and almost invariably, and I'm thinking of a New Zealand perspective here, and maybe it's not the case in the UK or the States, but there's 2 things that are constantly thrown at me. One is, how can you possibly support a Nazi regime which is just absolute nonsense. I mean, this business about clearing the Nazis out of the Donbass, I have yet to find one. I've not met one, and I've been there for 2.5 years. You know, it's a false flag operation, and Russian propaganda, as we know, is just so incredibly powerful that, you know, some people are bought into this rhetoric, this absolute nonsense. And the other thing, of course, is that, you know, people believe that that, you know, it's all around the US and NATO that this conflict has started. Well, Ukraine have been looking to the West for their future since their independence in 1992, more or less, and progressively so this last decade. And they want what, you know, they clearly have ambitions to become a leading country with a Western orientation. And this is perfectly fine. They are a sovereign state and they can make these decisions for themselves. Except Mr. Putin decided that didn't suit his needs. And we see now what has become, what was originally a war of colonialism has now quite clearly become a war of imperialism. And he's made no bones about that. He's been saber rattling at some of the old entities that were part of the USSR once upon a time, and that his quest to want to re-establish the USSR is now being, you know, blatantly, that's part of his rhetoric. And in the old days, he used to talk about, you know, and this is classic colonialism, really, Ukraine not being a country in and of itself. The Ukrainian language he didn't recognize and doesn't believe it's bona fide. And of course, he describes Zelensky as nothing more than a Jewish clan leader, and that Ukrainians are vassals, which is to say they need to pay homage to Mother Russia for the land that they have every right to till, you know. So we're going back and I'm saying to people, look, there are no Nazis. There's probably more Nazis in Russia than there are in Ukraine. And this is a false flag operation in every regard. And even if you do not buy into the politics, and that's fine, there are still innocent women, men, women, and children, elderly and the young, who are being hugely affected. I mean, in a combat operation of this scale, there's always three groups, if you will, that are affected more than others. And I'm not talking about soldiers here at all. So I'm pushing them aside. But it's the elderly, it's children, and it's animals every single time. Now, the Ukrainians, like Americans and like the Brits, love their cats and dogs. They are, you know, animal crazy. And they to have run at the speed that they've run, and to have left so many dogs and cats behind has been a heartbreak to many of them. And in the early days, late in the 22, you know, mid to late 20, we were constantly being asked to look out. If we go into this area, please look out for it. And we got photos of dogs and photos of cats. And if you look at my Facebook page, you'll see in the vehicles, we picked up dogs and they're sitting in the front seat with us. And it's not quite so much now because clearly they've all packed up and they're all, you know, roaming in packs together, those that are still alive. And they're becoming a little bit wild, but tragic, absolutely tragic. Now, the reason I'm telling you all these stories is that the splits based on, you know, assumed politics, most of which is incredibly inaccurate, but fueled by Russian propaganda, have led people to question me and why we're doing what we're doing, why anyone that's there is doing what they're doing. But it would be the same if we ultimately did take Kiwi Care to Beirut or back into Lebanon. When I say back, because I was there in uniform 20 years ago, but into Lebanon or anywhere else for that matter. There would always be, as I've discovered, a political split around there's somewhere else you should be, you know, and I get this all the time. How come you're not in Gaza? Well, what are you doing? You know, I say this to people. We're committed donkey deep in Ukraine, and we don't have the funds right now to split our resources. So what are you doing, sir? What are you doing, madam? Why are you asking me to go and, you know?
I totally get that, because I have these arguments with friends who are really committed to that conflict, and I'm like, this is what I'm involved in. I don't have the headspace to be able to take on the information on both of these things. So this is where I'm at. But I will also present, and this goes back full circle to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is, I think that as bad as that conflict is in Israel, Palestine, or Israel, Lebanon now, as bad as that is, and that's not to belittle any suffering that's taking place there, I think the geopolitical reach of the war in Ukraine is greater. And actually, absolutely. as
Absolutely
such,
right.
it has a greater importance, irrespective of the human casualties, etc., etc. But we could also argue that actually there's probably 1 million casualties of this war on both sides, to date.
Look,
So
you're right. I mean, you're postulating on geopolitics here, not on human suffering. And you're absolutely right in that. I mean, this human suffering is off the scale in Gaza, probably now in Lebanon and certainly in Beirut, and most definitely in Ukraine. But I do say this to people, that whatever you're reading about in Gaza, the atrocities in every regard, they are happening in Ukraine on a significantly larger scale still today.
So it's funny you should say that, because only this morning I made this point on my new, because I do these different news videos every single day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, like including Christmas Day. So but I made this point this morning that when Zaporizhia was hit with 13 guided glide bombs today into residential areas of Zaporizhia city, it's like, okay, this is terrible, but even I've become normalized, so I don't always report on this on a daily basis. But that is a war crime that has taken place, that has resulted in casualties, civilian casualties. And then one of my sources, Andrew Perpetua, is totting up with his organization called Touchny. They tot up statistics on a daily basis of all these things. And one of the things they're looking into is, particularly in Kherson, the amount of civilians who are targeted purposefully by drones. So Kherson particularly, and the river, Dnipro River up there, there's a phenomenon that's happening there more so than anywhere else on the front line, where the Russians appear to be possibly training their drone operators, or they're doing it for terrorist reasons or whatever, are targeting elderly, civilians, etc., and killing them. And that is murdering. Now, this is going on every single day. And when you add up all of these individual instances, it produces actually a really sizable statistic that is sometimes lost in the fog of war. And I think mainstream media outlets have got kind of bored or don't find it as shocking to communicate this to wider audiences. But I think people are forgetting how terrible the Ukraine war is on a daily basis.
Yeah, and you're quite right. Kherson is extremely dangerous. You're quite right.
Yeah, it's pretty horrible. I was there a couple of times, and it was evident to me that what they were doing to Kherson was terrorism as opposed to war. It was invariably just indiscriminate, like shells landing in civilian areas that had no military component at all. And you're thinking, well, that's terrorism. But yeah, so what have you learned about other people then? So you've learned, obviously, this is divisive, that there are certain people have their own idea of what's going on that's oftentimes incorrect, and that you've been surprised by some people who you otherwise wouldn't have thought would have been supportive end up being supportive.
Yeah. So I probably laboured the negative way too much, because the vast majority have been hugely supportive. If I look at the funding that's come out of New Zealand, that demonstrates the level of support that we've got. Just absolutely phenomenal. I was really just answering your question in many respects.
But no, of course.
That. But no, most people are.
Well, actually, that's probably an interesting point to dwell on for a bit, because New Zealand is an interesting place because it's so far away from the rest of the world. And it doesn't have the clout of other countries that we often talk about with regards to Ukraine in terms of finances, military, political heft, etc., etc. So it's its own kind of ecosystem down at the bottom of it. It's this, what is it? Oh, like Diamond? No, what's the 6 months in a leaky boat? Pearl at the bottom of the world. So it's this pearl at the bottom of the world.
We were talking about the song by a New Zealand band called Split Ends.
Split Ends. I think
right.
isn't the lyric 6 months is I think it's pearl at the bottom of the world. But anyway, but as a result, it might have a very different outlook to things and a different way of receiving information. We heard some time back, it was a good year or so ago now, that the New Zealand radio station, their news service, had been compromised by Russian. A few of their articles have been edited by a pro-Russian person. It was all a bit controversial. How does New Zealand sit in general with this war?
Yeah, that was a very specific case, and it would come as no surprise to anyone that he was fired.
Yeah.
Look, New Zealanders have a huge interest in global events, and take a keen interest in what's happening around the world. Where all of us, I think, focus on the American elections right now and all that's happening there. But when it comes to Ukraine or anywhere else for that matter, of course, there's a level of interest and there's a high level of empathy for those civilians who have been affected by the war, and whether that's displaced or injured or killed. I often get messages from people, a very specific, when they do a donation, they have a very specific something that they want done with that, which we do try and do, by the way. They want to give a stove or a water boiler to a particular area because they've done some research and often quite rightly discovered that it's pretty gnarly. And we try and fulfill that. So, while we are, diametrically, if you will, opposite in the polar sense, there's a level of interest in all that's going on around the world. I mean, New Zealanders are great travellers, as you know, Jonathan. So, while Kiwis are small in number, we can be found all over the world, a bit like the Irish in some respects.
Yeah.
And we I think we all travel as teenagers or in our early 20s, do the big OE, as it's called, overseas experience. And we come back, I think, having retained that interest in places that we've been to and lived in. I mean, my son lives in London. He's nearly 27, and he's got a complete life there and absolutely loving it. And I know that when he comes back to New Zealand, ultimately, if indeed he does, he'll have left his heart in that wonderful city. Part
Interesting.
of it, anyway.
Yeah. Well, so okay, going back to Ukraine then, what do you think has changed, if anything, in the Ukrainian outlook with regard to this war? Like, you obviously speak to Ukrainians, you're a human barometer, I guess, to some extent, of how people feel. What's a general sense now, 2.5 years in, and the changing ups and downs of the psychological effect this war's had?
Well, I think that is an absolute truth. They are on a sine wave of emotions in respect of how the war is going. And when I left in late last year, it was all pretty glum. But and I've come back to a hugely bullish environment, which is interesting because, if you look in parts of the Donbass under huge threat, but it's the Kursk operation. It's the Kursk operation that has absolutely lifted their spirits, and they're beside themselves. And
because I've been talking about that relationship between Pokrovsk and Kursk, and that being so positive, that being so negative, but actually this being a lot of leverage. And I don't want to get into long weeds of that, but that still is existing. Then the positivity of Kursk.
Yeah, hugely, and they've taken a swathe of ground, and there's still, I think, operations that will be conducted there. I don't think they're coming out anytime soon. And part of from a military perspective, flank protection is everything when you go and do something like that. And I would imagine they've shored up their flanks hugely. So they've got to withdraw. They know how they're going to withdraw when, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence that that's happening right now.
Interesting.
So to answer your question, very, very bullish about a number of things. Of course, concerned about others and hopeful that they're going to get the resources again to be able to step up and move forward again. However, as you know, it's winter soon, very soon.
Yeah.
Even here in Warsaw, you can feel a change. I've only been here 3 days, and it's quite a different feeling than what it was when I left Kiev some time ago. Sorry, 3 days ago. You know what I mean? The season in Eastern Europe changed very quickly. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And so I think there'll be a lot of activity between now and when the snow comes. You're seeing the reports, as we all are, that there's 250 attacks per day in and around Pokrovsk. So, but as far as I'm aware, the Ukrainians are holding off those attacks, and they're not giving too much ground away. That may change, of course, but in the main, there is a feeling of bullish is probably a bit of a strong word, but there's a feeling of heightened confidence compared to what there was when I left late last year.
It's always, for me, it's like I am on a roller coaster of emotions. I'm so closely attuned to what's going on in Ukraine that I'm just up and down. So like the US giving $8 billion, the rest of their presidential drawdown authority, USAI aid to Ukraine all in one. It's like, yeah, brilliant. But then you think, oh, November elections, what's going to go on there? Ugh. And then you're thinking, oh, F-16s, yeah. And then you're thinking, oh. And then you see, like, last night's another big Ukrainian set of strikes on ammunition depots and airfields. You're thinking, yeah, brilliant. That's what they need to do. And they're ramping up the production of attack drones, and they're doing these much more targeted attacks in a way that the Russians have been less able to do. They have improved in being able to take out infrastructure, but then the Ukrainians are getting much better in intercepting those drones on a mass level on a nightly basis. So it's just all up and down for me. And that's me just sitting here like in the safety of this room, like interpreting the data. Like for someone living through that, it must be just, you know, a roller coaster even more.
Indeed.
But there you go. And so for you, I guess with a kind of military hat on, but also living and experiencing it, what's your outlook for Ukraine? And I know there are so many contingencies here. Like, well, it depends on what the US election holds. It depends. But what do you feel is going to happen? What do you feel needs to happen? And what are your hopes and worries?
Well, I think, you know, the only pathway to peace for Ukraine and quite possibly for the rest of Europe, ultimately, is victory for Ukraine. I don't see it happening any other way. And as long as Zelensky is president, he has said they will. You know, what is peace? What does winning look like? It's back to the 2014 borders, which includes Crimea. So will that happen? I don't know, Jonathan. I really don't know. It's a big ask. But what I'm very sure about is getting them out and keeping them out are two entirely different things. And if they had the resources to get them out, there is only one entity on this planet that can help them hold them out, and that's called NATO. So I won't be surprised if in the future they get earlier than anticipated entry into NATO. It'll be a rough ride because there will be countries that will oppose that. And ultimately, I won't be surprised if they get earlier than we might otherwise anticipate entry into the EU. Ukraine has a long way to go to meet EU standards, but I won't be surprised if they've got the right leadership going forward from now on, working really hard to get to those EU standards, because this is where their focus is at the moment. Hey, look, you know, in a political environment like Eastern Europe, anything could change, of course, but at the moment, they are very focused on being a part of both NATO and the EU.
It's funny you should say that, because this morning I reported that Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, had just said in an interview that he foresees them joining NATO, but not before they join the EU. So he says the direction of travel for Ukraine will have to be joining EU before they get into NATO. And he said, and most people don't think EU will happen before 2030. So, I mean, these things are...
I think that's right, but 2030 is only in round figures 5 years away.
Yeah, so these things are
like anticipated. That would be early.
It only seems like last week when I was discussing things of a certain type, but it was 2022, like, and we're now just about to go into 2025. So yeah, it's just incredible how time flies. So what are the biggest threats? Obviously Russia, etc., but what are the biggest challenges, and how do you see them being overcome? What are your big worries for Ukraine?
Losing the war, really.
Yeah.
You know, that's the...
But how does that happen? How does that happen?
Well, you know, there's constant talk about a nuclear attack of some sort, and I can only presume this is a tactical nuclear weapon system being deployed somewhere. And while in 22, when that was happening, I thought it was just, you know, ridiculous saber rattling, I'm less convinced about that today. I think, and I say this for two particular reasons. One is that the constant attacks on the Zaporizhia nuclear power station are interesting, and that, you know, that would be a nuclear attack, and if it was to melt down. However, it's not like Chernobyl. I've you know, talked to many people about this. The technology is such that theoretically, nothing like that should ever happen at Zaporizhia. However, it's not designed to have missiles arrive on a, you know, semi-daily basis. That's for sure. And the other thing was the destruction of the Novokhovka Dam. A completely not a military target in any regards, and the environmental damage that's been done is decades and decades into the future. And when I think to myself, hitting the Zaporizhia power station as regularly as they do with missiles, drones, whatever, and the destruction of Novokhovka, I think, you know, then therefore it's potentially conceivable that a tactical nuclear weapon could be deployed for sure.
Yeah,
and I worry about that. That would be my biggest worry, because that would change everything. Although that would probably trigger a NATO response, I would think.
Yes, yeah, and that's it. And this is, I mean, we sometimes think about Russia doing these things without thinking about, actually, is that in Russia's best interest? And of course, that's a last chance saloon thing for Russia to do, because actually the likelihood of them really doing that is very minimal, given that it's clearly not in their best. That's the end of Russia. That happens, that's the end of Russia. So, you know, it would, and it's
theoretically, look, there's been a number of things that have happened here, the atrocities that have been committed, the human atrocities, the war crimes, the use of hyperbaric weapon systems and what have you, which, you know, I would have thought, so I don't know where the line is anymore. I don't know what it's going to take for people to say, right, we've had a gutsful now. And I really don't know.
Right, I've got a few thanks for viewers and a couple of questions for you, and then we'll just we'll sort of wrap things up and talk about, you know, where people can how and where people can help you. I just want to say thanks to Goose Springsteen, who said thanks to the stream and both of you for your hard work in support of Ukraine. Thank you very much for your support of the channel, Goose Springsteen. It's very kind. Kevin Forst gifting 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships. That's very kind of you, Kevin, and thanks for your question earlier. Para Andy listening in, not so much chat from me, but thank you very much for supporting nonetheless, Para Andy. Richard Bennett is always a fine supporter of the channel, gifting 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships as well. And then finally, so thank you to all of you. Finally, from Goose Springsteen again, and a question for you, or for both of us: what are both of your thoughts on the morality or necessity of Ukrainian men who have become adults in the last 2 years whilst outside of Ukraine being compelled to return to help the war effort? And I guess you could extend that to just people in general who have draft evaded or moved out of Ukraine, or even had lived previously out of Ukraine. All sorts of elements there. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't really have thoughts on that, and of course every government would react differently to that. If the US was at war in any regard, I would be interested to see how you know, the government of the day reacted to that. But what I will say is I think Zelensky's been really clever and not, you know, conscripting 18-year-olds. And I think it started at 25. It might have been 26, and it's now
it's 27 and then moved to 25. So he moved it a little bit.
Right. And I thought that was really sensible. And you know, the Ukrainians, the Ukrainians are a lot like, you know, Brits and Americans and Kiwis. They're pretty tough sort of guys. They love sport. They can get up, and they're physical. The men are very physical creatures, and you know, that appeals to our countries, because we're all of us like that. We like tough physical sports, and we like sort of, you know, that sort of an outdoor environment for those that enjoy that. They are these people. They're hardy people. They're very, very good soldiers, extremely good soldiers. And if they and look, the US, the Brits, and we have even been in, you know, we've had our Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment trainers in the UK helping train the Ukrainian soldiers.
Operation Interflex,
yeah. So I think Zelensky did a good job with that age bracket.
Yeah, there's some interesting things happening, like, for example, Czechia and Poland training up diaspora community Ukrainians into brigades, rather than sending people back and stuff like that, giving them the opportunity to join up abroad to make sure they have the requisite training, decent enough training that takes long enough to do properly, and then saying, right, now you're ready to go back, which I think is an interesting way around that. But yeah, it's such a difficult one, because there's the whole argument about refugee status versus you know, conscientious objector versus, you know, someone that's a draft dodger, right? And there are some fine lines here, and you know, it is. I did a whole video on that at some point in the past. You reminded me, actually, didn't you say that you were doing something to do with Ukrainian rugby or something?
I knew you were going to ask that. I've been waiting for it. And my hint was about sport. Yes. So 2 of my trustees on Kiwi Care, Sir Graham Henry, Ted, the award-winning All Black coach, won all the games, World Cup included, of the day, and Brent Impey. And I've had Brent in Kiev. Now, Brent was a past chairman of New Zealand Rugby. He's current chair of Fiji Drua Rugby, and has a huge international background in rugby administration. So we have been meeting with Ukrainian rugby to talk about, and this conversation's been evolving for the past almost year, really, certainly 6 or 7 months. And it was great to have Brent in Kiev with me this last week to meet with the board of Ukrainian Rugby to say, look, here's a plan that he's got and that we're going to help facilitate. But it's all around the European competitions, which have a championship competition, a trophy competition, and a concession competition. And sadly, Ukraine relegated from trophy to concession recently. It's to help with that. The first 15, if you will, it'll be 30 players, but you know what I mean, the first 15. To help with the development of under 18s and under 20s. And we're really hoping we might be able to get these kids to New Zealand as developmental squads. And the last and really important one is both men's and women's 7-side rugby. And the plan there is to get them to a level where they're accepted into the 2026 Olympic Games in Los Angeles.
Wow. Because for some people, rugby sevens is the way in. It's a more glamorous way in. You've only got, for those who don't know, you only got 7 people on the pitch. It's not so technical. It's a free flowing. You're running.
Well, it is technical. It's fast. You need to be a super fast runner. But the game of sevens relies on defence. You've got to have a very, very good defensive posture. But
lack of technical, as in you don't have scrums. You got 3 men scrums rather than 8 men scrums, etc., etc. So it is a simpler game in many ways, and it is a good gateway to the game as a whole. That sounds really fascinating.
And key to this is the women's game as well. Right. Because if you look at, Ukrainians are great sports people. Whether it's soccer, which of course, Europe plays soccer, the world plays soccer. We forget that in New Zealand. We think the world plays rugby. They don't. And of course, they've got an incredible women's volleyball team. The Ukrainians, and Yulia Gerasimova, for those that remember the heartbeat thing with the referee to try and get him to change a decision, went just viral. Amazing. So they're just these hardy, wonderful people, very sporty, great sense of humor. I just love the Ukrainians, just a wonderful sense of humor. And as I say to people, men of my age, so in their early 60s, Ukrainian men remind me of my grandfather. There's nothing they won't do to help. There's no time that they won't give you. If we blow a tire as we always do, on the roads down in the east, 3 truck drivers, and I'm talking truck drivers of B trains, big trucks, will stop, push us out of the way, put the big boys' toys under us like a pit crew, and we're up and running again in 5 or 10 minutes. Just incredible. Brilliant. I mean, I know if a car breaks down on Auckland Southern Motorway, no one's going to stop to help.
No one gives a shit. Yeah. Well, look, interesting point about rugby in terms of a bit of a history here, but it's a weird thing. So rugby's only played in certain places in the world, certain countries in Europe, and then you've got weird places like Uruguay and Argentina. And Argentina at the moment has just beaten South Africa and Australia, haven't they? It's like absolutely on fire.
But the Pumas are, they're a good team, really good.
Yeah, team. Absolutely. Yeah, but that's taken some time and effort. But anyway, there are certain places in the world that play rugby, and weirdly, places like Georgia and Romania historically have had a really good rugby pedigree, and that's, as the way I understand it, and you may know more than I do, the way I understand it is the Soviet Union, they used to use rugby as a way of keeping their police and army fit and healthy and strong and muscly and all macho and what
they did. The Russians had a team, but Georgia, to your point, and this is really where this thinking stemmed from, they're a good team, and they have just won the European Championship. And interestingly, Switzerland won the next level down, which is called the Trophy Championship. And unfortunately, Poland were relegated out of the championship down to trophy, and very sadly, Ukraine were relegated from trophy down to conference. And so this is where our thinking. So there's a range of European countries that play rugby that the world may not know about, but it's done within this European context, and that's the context within which we're advising, if we can advise, the Ukrainians around a developmental plan.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But it is fascinating that it kind of goes back to the Soviet era, and that's why you get these like Eastern Bloc countries or former Eastern Bloc countries that have this connection to rugby. Like you end up watching the World Cup and thinking, what the hell are Romania and Georgia in the World Cup type thing? And of course, that's a historical connection. Look, thank you very much to the Weasel, by the way, for a super sticker there. Very kind of you. Look, how can people really help you? It would be lovely to hear some feedback of, by the way, I've got the lyrics to the 6 months in the leaky boat. It's Aotearoa, which means New Zealand in Maori, rugged individual.
Aotearoa translated means land of the long white cloud. It doesn't mean New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely. Land of the long white cloud. Aotearoa, rugged individual, glisten like a pearl, at the bottom of the world. There's my best Finn brothers impression. Anyway, in fact, one of my kids is called Finn partly because of the Finn brothers. Right. Anyway, that's irrelevant. No one needs to know that. Right. Kiwi Care. How can people help you? And it would be really nice if my viewership can shift the needle in some, at least.
Well, look, it's all about funding, really. It's funds that we need to keep the wheels of humanitarian aid rolling. But if anybody out there is listening and you are a high net worth, or you have a large organization that would like to commit to us in some way on a monthly basis, behind the scenes or otherwise, or you have influence and sway with organizations or high net worths that might be interested, I would happily fly to the US or back to the UK to do presentations and to meet people. But as we started, and I'll finish on this 70 minutes later, if we had strategic funding at that level, we could absolutely move the dial in Ukraine for those who need it most.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the meantime, you can give your own individual amounts, and that will be no doubt super appreciated. Just find Kiwi Care. That's Care with a K. And you can find Tenby Powell on Twitter. You can find Tenby Powell on Facebook, and you can find Kiwi Care by looking around. That link is in the description to the video below. So please help out as and how you can. Stephen Bendel says a huge thank you to Kiwi Care. Great work indeed.
Thank you, Stephen.
And indeed, Tenby Pie, who helps out so much. So thank you, Tenby. Massive respect for the selfless work you do. Absolutely, 100%, definitely in agreement with that. Well, look, are there any final words that you have to say?
Just thank you to your viewers, your audience. Thank you to you, Jonathan, for this time. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I'm just very grateful for all the support we get from wherever it comes from. It's amazing human beings. And I guess that is the final thought. Let's not lose faith in humanity. It's easy to do so right now, because there's a lot of things that are happening in the world that would suggest that we are in fact at war, like almost everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important not to lose faith in humanity. Human beings are fundamentally good. I think we could learn a thing or two. We could learn a thing or two from dogs, that's for sure.
Yeah,
they could teach us an awful lot. But I think it's important to keep our heads up and just keep moving on and supporting each other and loving each other. I think that's a critical part of it.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. Look, the final thing for me, and this is Mitch Mazarol from Canada, and just an interesting point here. He says, totally missed the boat today, just arrived. That said, here's something for the T Fund. Thank you very much for that, Mitch. Mitch is a strong supporter of Médecins Sans Frontières, which is Doctors Without Borders. We've actually mentioned that. And Mitch has got a friend who was over working in there, who's now back in Canada because he's lost his hearing due to an explosion in the building as he was doing his work for Médecins Sans Frontières. So super important. Anyway, knowing how utterly critical an ample supply is for the channel output, tea is what keeps me going. So thank you very much. Really appreciate that, Mitch. And please help out Kiwi Care, guys. Look, thanks, Tenby. Really appreciate that. Stay on the line while I just end the stream. But in the meantime, everybody, thank you so much for joining in. Thanks for the live chats and the support for the channel. But it's much more important you guys support Kiwi Care, so let's give a boost to them, and keep an eye on Tenby. Follow him on Twitter, follow him on Facebook, and really check out what he's doing, which is great work. Thanks, mate. Really appreciate that. Thanks everybody.
Jonathan.
Take care.
Tremendous.